Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's web conference on the Generation Deliverability Methodology Review straw proposal. My name is Elena Koppel of Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs here at the California ISO, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm joined by Neil Miller, VP of Infrastructure and Operations Planning, Danielle Mills, Principal for Infrastructure Policy Development, and Robert Sparks, Senior Manager, Regional Transmission South. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission, and the meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please keep your comments professional and respectful, and please try to be brief and refrain from repeating what's already been said so we can manage time efficiently. To raise your hand if you connected through the computer, use the Call Me option. Select the raise hand icon at the bottom of your window. And if you dialed into the meeting outside of WebEx, you can hit #2 to join the question queue. And please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comments. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. Today's event producer is Adrian. And you can send your questions in the chat to all panelists or to me directly, Elena Koppel of Alford. And here we are in the process. At the beginning, we are reviewing the straw proposal that was posted last week. I'm going to hand it over to Danielle to cover that.
Thanks, Elena. I'm just going to give a little bit of background and a summary of some of the key issues with Neil, and then we'll hand it over to Robert to lead the discussion and talk through the straw proposal with all of you before we come back to a schedule at the end of the stakeholder call. Next slide, please. So we view the purpose of the ISO's deliverability methodology as being to test that the transmission system can reasonably ensure that resource adequacy capacity can be delivered at times of stressed system conditions. However, these resources first have to meet basic interconnection requirements so that we know that they can be reliably interconnected and that they could choose to operate energy only without providing resource adequacy capacity. Next slide, please. Just a bit of background on the ISO's deliverability assessment methodology. It was initially developed in 2005 and approved by FERC and the PUC, and we started using it in 2006 with some guidance from PJM's model and a similar approach that's used by MISO. We did complete a comprehensive review in 2019 and 2020 in response to a changing resource fleet and a peak shift. This was the point where we began looking at the high system need and secondary system need approach. And then since 2019 and 2020, we've made other adjustments as well, aligned with the relaxation of the WEC standards, and we've also adjusted the dispatch levels for storage. We did hear requests for another review last year through the ISO's policy catalog, which raised a number of new concerns that hadn't been expressed in some of the earlier reviews. So in December of 2022, the ISO produced an update paper and then subsequently published an issue paper in May of 2023. And that brings us to where we are today and looking through the straw proposal. Next slide, please. Oh, and apologies, I should mention too that we do see the deliverability assessment methodology initiative as well aligned with the resource adequacy initiative as well as the interconnection process enhancements initiative. And so it is sort of by design that we're moving all of these working group processes and stakeholder initiatives forward in tandem with one another and parallel with one another and trying to coordinate some of the concepts between those different initiatives as well. So just a little bit of background on how the transmission needs are identified and managed. As many of you know, the transmission planning process is where we approve larger area deliverability upgrades for preferred zones, and then that capacity is allocated among the resources that are going to move forward. The generator interconnection process identifies the smaller local deliverability upgrades that then depend on the specific resources inside of the zones. the generation interconnection process also identifies reliability requirements needed to allow the resources to physically connect and be energized, as well as interconnection requirements. And I will turn it over to Neil for the next slide.
Okay, it's Neil here. Yes, thank you. If we could move to the next slide. So I was just going to step briefly through a summary of the different issues, not wanting to go into them in too much detail because the bulk of Robert's presentation will be to walk through each of these various issues and our straw proposal on a case by case as we go through each individual issue. But I did just want to touch first on the summary of where we're at, where we see that with the evolution of the fleet and the evolving system needs, that there is the opportunity in concert with what's happening on the interconnection process enhancements effort, as well as we move forward into reviewing our own resource adequacy program, that there was opportunity to make some significant proposals here for some material changes in our current practices. Just to touch on those briefly, when it comes to the issue of the high system need and secondary system need, as Robert will explain, the fleet characteristics have been changing quite significantly over the last couple of years, and based on that information, we are proposing to actually remove the secondary system need from the interconnection deliverability studies, but still continue to test in the transmission planning environment if there are emerging concerns. On the dispatch level questions, this is an issue that has obviously generated a lot of attention as well. We do see that some of the proposals that overall, we think that we're on track with our current approach of using an exceedance methodology for setting our dispatch levels for study purposes. We know this is a particular issue for the wind community, but we have been taking a hard look at this and think that at the present time, we need to stick with our own exceedance methodology approach, and we can touch on that in more detail. When it comes to the simultaneous dispatch question, we are proposing some changes regarding the distribution factor thresholds for 500 kV constraints. When we look at the local capacity issues, there are a few things there that are happening in parallel. One is that the interconnection process enhancements changes that are already being reflected in FERC Order 2023, as well as directionally through our own stakeholder process. We are expecting some of the concerns around export out of local capacity areas to be managed through those processes. But then the further discussion around actually creating separate local capacity products that are not capable of also providing system capacity, that whole concept needs to be explored more holistically in our resource adequacy program. When it comes to the N-2 contingencies, this has also been a bit of a contentious issue with a number of our stakeholders. We do see that there are and remain differences of opinion about how some of the other jurisdictions may be handling these issues. At the end of the day, though, we do see that needing to mitigate the N-2 contingencies on double circuit towers is something that we do need to continue to carry forward. But we also recognize that in balancing the risk and reward around the disruption the N-2 contingency mitigations can create, that we are proposing a solution to avoid having those mitigations stand in the way of resources getting access to deliverability. One issue that didn't come up earlier but was discussed in the straw proposal, so we're seeking additional comment on, is the threshold criteria for how we delineate between area deliverability network upgrades and local deliverability network upgrades. This is an area where there had been some adjustments a few years ago that were responding to the concerns of the day. They may have been triggering some unintended consequences, and this is something we think needs a second look. So in the straw proposal, this one's a bit of a different topic where we're actually identifying this issue as being collateral to some of the other concerns, and we're looking for additional stakeholder input before we actually propose a change. And then on the last item, based on feedback we've received, we saw a fair bit of interest in something we had floated earlier around trying to manage the risk created for projects that are in flight moving forward, the schedule risks created by deliverability network upgrades being delayed, and wanting to reassess the risk between disrupting those projects versus allowing them to move forward on a conditional deliverability framework and being able to continue to their original in-service state without being disrupted, which in those cases has created a lot of concern and churn in the industry, depending on the impacts on the resources power purchase agreements. So we do think that there are a number of areas here we're proposing some pretty substantial changes. We're looking forward to walking through those in detail and then getting your feedback as we continue to refine these proposals. So I'll stop there and see if there are any preliminary questions that we can help with before we actually go into the detailed discussion and straw proposal.
Yeah, we have a hand from Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan.
Neil, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I guess I don't want to jump the gun, and if you're going to address some of these questions later, I certainly can wait until Robert's presentation. So let me just try a couple and see if you'd like to delay them. I'm certainly okay with that. The issue of the simultaneous dispatch and the local capacity products. When you talk about having it be considered more holistically, do you have a particular venue in mind where that might occur?
Yes, we are expecting that to take place, that item to be discussed in the ISO's resource adequacy stakeholder process. I'm not sure if I have the exact timing, but it is expected to get underway later this year. I'll turn to Danielle to see if you have a tighter timing for that, but that's the venue we're targeting, is the ISO's resource adequacy discussion.
Okay.
And I believe October is the timing that we're looking at for that getting kicked off.
Okay. Okay, because I didn't see it mentioned there before. So is this just in another phase of that effort, or how is that going? Is that how that will play out?
When you say another phase, we expect the policy team at the ISO to be leading a fairly broad discussion about the ISO's resource adequacy program and how it should evolve, especially in light of both the changes on the resource fleet side as well as changes to better align with what's happening in the West and with CPUC's transition to a slice of day resource adequacy program. So
okay,
we
so
do
you don't
see,
mean the existing RA enhancements initiative. You mean this is a new initiative?
yes, a broader initiative. Yes.
Okay. And on number 6, the delayed deliverability upgrades. I think there is also concern about RNUs like circuit breakers and other things. So is this solution that you're proposing really mainly targeted toward DNUs, but would it also possibly include RNUs as well?
Here we're talking about deliverability network upgrades. I would say in general, we would think that if something is classed a reliability network upgrade, and especially something that impacts fault current levels and short circuit duty on breakers, not seeing the same level of flexibility there as about needing the RNU to be in place before we can actually allow a facility to close in. So right now we're focusing on the deliverability discussion, yes.
Okay, and details on the this conditional reliability or conditional deliverability, things like assuming that no other constraints are binding, or it's sort of general things. Should I save those questions for Robert's presentation?
I think that would be best, yeah.
Okay,
I was
great.
trying to provide a summary here of the overall issues and where we think we can make some pretty big changes, and a couple areas where we see a bit more limited set of circumstances, just to set the tone. But the detailed questions we should get into the proposal, the detailed discussion itself.
Okay, I'll be happy to wait for that. Thanks very much,
Great,
Neil.
thanks.
Okay, there's no other questions in queue.
Okay. In that case, Robert, would you care to move us forward?
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. Probably next two slides. Yeah, go. Yeah. So as you can see, I'll be going through this list of topics. It's the same list of topics Neil just went through. So we've had a good overview, and I'll get into some more detail in the following slides. I'll basically go over kind of a little more of an overview of what the topic's about, look into some stakeholder comments and ISO responses to those comments, and then a proposal, and then after each one, we could stop for questions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. No, thank you. I have a delay on mine. So the first topic is this highest system need and second system need study scenarios. So currently, both scenarios are studied. For the HSN scenario, the load, generation dispatch, and import assumptions correspond to when the RA need is the highest, which is typically the peak load day of the year, or very high load days, when solar production is very low. The SSN scenario is also based on the peak load day, but it focuses on the time period when solar production is rapidly dropping off and replacement resources are ramping up. So that's basically what we've been doing, as Neil already introduced. Next slide, please. So the stakeholder comments we got on this topic was that last year we reduced the battery dispatch assumptions in the SSN study from 100% down to 50%, and we got some comments saying that we should go lower, such as from 50% to 30%. We also got comments more generally from stakeholders that the SSN study timeframe is really just a congestion concern in their opinion, and that resource shortages are not a concern. And so those are generally the two main comments we got. Moving to the next slide. So certainly taking all those comments in mind, and also looking at in the straw proposal paper, we explained how the 2018 and the 2022 summer assessments, which we used as the basis for the SSN study, they showed that a resource shortage conditions can occur during the SSN study period. So based on those, we had a hard time really getting on board with some of the stakeholder comments. As you can see in this chart, the top of the slide shows the, I think it's the 2022 summer assessment, or it could be the 2018. They were very similar. However, in the 2023, this most recent summer assessment, which is the lower chart in this slide, it indicated that the risk of resource shortages during the SSN period may be less of a concern. Now, there's more hydro in 2023, so there's some other things going on, but it certainly, coupled together with the stakeholder comments, gave us reason to think about it more deeply. So next slide, please. So based on stakeholder comments and the most recent summer assessment information, the ISO, after considerable thought, we are proposing to remove the SSN scenario from generation interconnection studies. However, there is still the concern that this scenario could be a problem, and so we will continue to perform the SSN studies in the transmission planning process basically as a screening tool for further analysis. That's really what we've been doing anyway, is the SSN study just provides an indicator that there could be a problem, and then we look at the various other studies that we're doing and make a decision whether or not we think a policy project is needed. And there were other provisions, but based on this proposal, assuming it moves forward, some of that would be unnecessary. But we still would do the analysis in the transition planning process. So that's about all I had on the HSN, SSN. Are there any questions on this part?
There's a hand raised from Pushkar Waggle, Flynn Resource Consultants.
Pushkar Waggle from Flynn Resource Consultants. Can you hear me, Robert?
Yes.
Hey, first of all, I just want to start off by saying that we really appreciate your openness and willingness to responding to the stakeholder questions, concerns, and the proposals that we had. I just have one specific question on slide 15. The last bullet indicates that you're proposing to continue to perform SSN study in TPP as a screening tool for further analysis. Would that mean that sort of, DNUs will not be triggered in the annual TPP purely based on SSN? Like, I know that it's not pretty often, but there have been a couple of instances like the Lugo Victor Kramer corridor constraints where SSN was sort of more binding than HSN. So HSN showed, not exactly an overload, but close to an overload, but it was SSN that was basically more binding, and that's pretty rare. But going forward, are you suggesting that it will be more like you'll consider that SSN study and dig that a little bit deeper before you consider it for approval, or how are you going to treat that going forward in the transmission planning process?
Well, actually, the SSN was never a completely binding study in the TPP by itself. We always had the provision where if we, in the transmission planning process, decided that an upgrade was not justifiable, that we would, not propose an upgrade. But what that would mean was that any generators in the interconnection process that were behind that SSN constraint would be considered deliverable, even though we're actually hitting the constraint up to the portfolio amount that we studied. Now, that was something that I think a lot of people went over their heads and nobody really understood what we were saying, but it basically was that it wasn't a binding test. So
Understood.
I think we would continue along the same process. It would just be something to flag for further analysis.
Understood. Thanks for that clarification, Robert. That's all I had. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more hands in queue and a question in the chat. We can go to Ryan Millard next.
Resources. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, hi.
Firstly, I just wanted to extend my appreciation as well to the CAISO for your willingness to reevaluate the risk of resource shortages during the SSN period, and to extend our support for your proposal to remove the SSN study from the deliverability studies. We felt the change was highly responsive to the concerns we've raised in previous comments, but that it was also supported based on the analysis you provided. I think the previous comment in question is the same question that I had. So I guess my only addition to that was if it's going to be used as a screening tool, if there's any proposal to reintroduce that, where would that be reintroduced and how would that be communicated to stakeholders so that we have an opportunity to evaluate whatever analysis you're using to justify that reintroduction?
I would think we would have another stakeholder process. I wouldn't imagine we would remove it in a stakeholder process and then, in the future put it back in without a stakeholder process. But,
And It's Neil here. I'd just like to jump in and also chime in on what Robert just said, is that we would not see just reintroducing any new criteria into the deliverability methodology without a due process. I think the point that Robert was really wanting to drive home with the mention about a screening tool is we are moving forward with a more complex fleet across the board than many of our neighbors and other ISOs are managing. So constantly reassessing if a new reliability risk is emerging as the fleet evolves and the transmission requirements to serve that fleet have to evolve with it. That's just something we're going to be having to keep our eye on an ongoing basis. That's basically our new reality. But if we saw a new set of conditions or a reemergence of a priority of this type of analysis, we would expect to consult and go through a full, as we're proposing for any changes here, going through a full consultation process on it.
Great. Really appreciate that. And I think that's a prudent way to approach this. So thank you both again.
Thank you.
Let's go to the hand from Susan Schneider.
Yes, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I just, as you mentioned before, 2023 was a little bit of an anomalous year, and with high hydro and a couple of other things. And I'm just wondering, did you do an analysis looking at the UCM hours where you sort of did more of a hydro normalization and or temperature normalization potentially, but at least a hydro normalization?
It's Neil here. I should probably chime in on that because I was more involved with the resource assessment as we were earlier in the year. And Robert mentioned the hydro resources were one of the things at play, but we had also studied some average hydro conditions. The overall trend seemed to stay relatively consistent across those two, and it looked like the effectiveness of the battery storage as the fleet continues to grow, spread out over a broader area with a significant increase in battery storage resources seemed to be the predominant effect here. But we can't rule out the fact that the hydro has been an issue, and we did not study low hydro scenarios, for example. So we do see the bulk of this effect being associated with the evolution of the fleet itself, with a potential for a secondary impact from the hydro. But certainly the battery storage and the fleet evolution was the primary driver.
Would it be possible, since you've already done the analysis for normalized hydro, would it be possible for normal hydro conditions, would it be possible for the CAISO to release the sort of, maybe in the similar format that you've already provided here for the 2023? Would it be possible to see that analysis that's already done?
I'm not sure we have it graphed in this form. I'll take a look at that. Just thinking of how the results were characterized in our summer assessment, which is where the reference is for this actually. I'll take a look, but I don't want to commit to a ton of work recrafting the graphs out of that case, unless
I think it would help. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to do a whole bunch of new analysis, but since it sounds like you've already done it, yeah, if it would be possible to do that, I think it would just help in the understanding of how things are changing here.
Okay, but so Susan, you're actually proposing that we put it back in?
Put it back into just release it. I mean, not. I'm not sure. I don't understand the question.
Oh, I mean, it just sounded like you're hesitant about us making this change.
Yes, I think so. I think representing LSA has strongly supported the SSN, and I think we're open to thinking about this, but would just like all the information. So it's really just an information request.
I'll see what we can pull out. Like I said, in terms of how the information was being graphed at the time, I'm not sure we have this readily available, but I'll see what we can do.
Okay, that would be very, very helpful if you could. Thank you so much, Neil. That's all I have.
Okay, and there's There's one question in the chat from David McMillan, Megawatt Storage Farms. Can you define battery dispatch assumption?
I'm not sure what context, but in the SSN study, we study batteries at 50% of their nameplate capacity, of their 4-hour nameplate capacity. Not sure what else they're looking for.
Okay, David says, okay, thanks.
So if there's no more
That's
questions,
all the questions.
Let's
That's
move
all the
on to the
questions
next.
we have for now.
Great. Next slide. Okay. So this next topic is the generation dispatch levels assumed in the deliverability study. Just as background, generation is dispatched in the initial base case in the deliverability study at close to maximum dependable capacity. A study group is established for each line and transformer that includes all generation with a 5% distribution factor or greater. Then the output of a subset of those generators in the study group are incrementally increased to the full study amount. Wind and solar generation generators are dispatched up to 20%, their 20% exceedance level in the HSN study. That's their study amount, is their 20% exceedance level, at least in the HSN study, and focusing on the HSN mostly given the last topic we just talked about. Then the other generators are dispatched up to their NQC level. So that's, you know, at a high level, we went through this in much more detail in the issue paper, but just as a reminder. So the next slide, please. Stakeholder comments on the dispatch levels were that generators should not be studied above their NQC values. An example was provided by stakeholders, at least a group of stakeholders, showing a 100 megawatt wind generator behind a 56 megawatt transmission constraint, and then a 30 megawatt battery was added to that example, and then basically suggesting that both resources should receive full RA credit. Then really between the comments and looking at that example, you know, and taking into account that the NQC of a wind generator in the example was 14 megawatts. So in effect, the stakeholder was really just, at least to us, it seemed like they were suggesting that only 14, with a transmission system with only 14 megawatts of available transmission was all that was needed for a 100 megawatt wind farm to be fully deliverable. We interpreted the comments, so we're characterizing them here. Another comment was that not all generators in the queue will be built, so dispatch levels should just be discounted. So again, that's just generally our summary of the comments. They're all, by the way, all the comments are posted if you want to see them all. But next slide, please. So in response to those comments, the ISO points out that the HSN study, in the HSN study, the solar study amounts are already at a very low level and are approximately 10% of their maximum capability. So the stakeholders' concerns seem to be focused primarily on the wind generation study amounts. And although in the HSN study, wind study amounts are higher than the NQC values, it is because wind production levels are more variable on a temporal and geographic basis. And basically the main ISO response is that the proposal to study only up to the NQC values for wind and solar generation, to us, is a fundamental gap as it relates to the RA program. And I'll elaborate on this more in the next slide. So next slide, please. The ELCC-based NQC values for solar and wind resources are based on stochastic simulations. The values represent a theoretical equivalent generator. So for example, a 100 megawatt wind generator is deemed to provide the same average contribution to reliability as a 14 megawatt generator that is able to produce 14 megawatts in all hours. But in reality, that the individual wind generator will be producing 0 megawatts in many hours when you need it. But in many hours, it will be producing more than 14 megawatt hours when you need it. So that's good. But when it's producing 0, obviously that's bad. So if there were a transmission constraint that prohibited that generator from ever producing more than 14 megawatts of output, it would really no longer be equivalent to a 14 megawatt perfect generator. You know, it's essentially the hours where it's producing more than 14 megawatts are compensating for the hours where it's producing nothing. And so over a period of time, statistically, in a stochastic analysis, it appears to be providing the same benefit as this 14 megawatt gas turbine, if you will. But again, if you just prohibit it from ever producing more than 14, well, you get 0 or you get 14, but you never get more than 14. So it never compensates for the time when it's producing nothing. So that's just seems problematic to us to restrict its output that much. Next slide, please. So moving on, the ISO also notes that the CPUC adopted a decision to replace the ELTC approach with a slice of day methodology and also an exceedance methodology built within that. So the ISO will continue to monitor the development of AQC values and evaluate the need for further updates to its deliverability study methodology as those new values get rolled out. Then regarding the comment on factoring in queue attrition into the dispatch assumptions, we think it is already addressed in a different way. If there's more generation in the queue than in the TPP resource portfolio, that constraint is typically identified as an area constraint, and the associated upgrade costs are not actually assigned to the interconnection customers. As Danielle talked about, those are addressed in the transition planning process, and deliverability is allocated, from the perspective that we assume not all the generation is going to get built, so we build enough transmission and allocate it to the ones that do get built. So with all that said, the ISO is not proposing any changes to dispatch levels at this time and believes that its methodology for determining dispatch levels in the deliverability studies is reasonable. So with that, are there any questions on this topic?
We've got 2 hands. The first hand was from Dariush.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi Dariush.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to make sure that we understand when I'm talking about generation deliverability assessment or generation deliverability test that you call it from time to time, I'm only talking about generation deliverability within the context of GIP or GitUp, not TPP. There, of course, you should be a lot more careful about a lot of factors. Here, the goal is to see whether a generator can offer its RA capacity into the grid or not, and count towards the RA capacity counting in where the total capacity of all RA resources with must-off obligation is equal to the peak demand plus certain percentage, additional percentage, 15 to 18% more. So that's in that context I'm talking about. The process of deliverability assessment test in GitUp is intended to see whether there is TPD capacity available. It's all about it, TPD capacity available to assign to a project. Let's not think about at this time about all the other commercial tests and so on, whether there is TPD capacity available to be assigned to a project and then reserved for that TPD capacity is reserved for that project on basically flow gates, constrained flow gates, or constrained path flows, where that TPD capacity is reserved for that project for as long as that project maintains its deliverability assignment. So it's the purpose of that is to assign certain transmission capacity, transmission deliverability capacity to a project so that first to see whether it's available for that project and then assign it to that project and then retain it for that project for as long as that project maintains deliverability status. What CAISO is doing, if a project has a QC of, say, 14% valuable energy resource, it can never, for the purpose of RA, again, this is for the purpose of RA counting only. This is, we're talking about deliverability assessment within GitHub. For the purpose of RA capacity, that resource can never claim more capacity than its QC, qualifying capacity. In the process of you reserving 3 times or 4 times its QC in TPD capacity, you're reserving TPD capacity, very valuable TPD capacity, to a resource so that it can, at certain time, produce more megawatt, maybe 20% of the time here, based on current exceedance method value used, to produce that extra megawatt and put it into the grid. You're basically reserving very valuable TPD capacity to a resource whose QC cannot be, whose RA capacity cannot be counted beyond its QC. So you're setting aside 3 times as much of capacity aside for that project. That may be 20% of the time that capacity may be available, and that 20% of the time may not even correspond to the time where capacity is needed. As opposed to opening that capacity, making that capacity available so that it can be used by thousands of megawatts, tens of thousands of megawatts of storage resources that can grab that capacity, become commercially viable, get built, and then give you that capacity as a dispatchable resource for certain, because now that capacity is available, the storage resource grabs it, and it becomes commercially viable, it gets built, and then all of a sudden you have that capacity at your disposal, dispatchable for certain. Not maybe it will be available because it's 20% of the time the capacity gets that amount. We're talking about this capacity counting, and we'll kind of come back to it later on when we talk N-2. Now, what happens at TPPS processes is different. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about wasting away valuable TPD capacity for certain amount of generation that project may produce, and it may produce it at a time where the system doesn't even need it. But you're setting aside, as opposed to giving it to a lot of storage resources that could benefit from that capacity and become viable and make the capacity available to you so that you can use it. And by the way, that storage capacity also cuts back on curtailment of the resource, reducing the need for additional transmission to deal with curtailment, and all kinds of other benefits that would come from storage resources that become, in this sense, commercially viable. So this is, by the way, the example that you point out. Of course, it was an example just to elucidate this point. It was not a real example. It's a 2-bus system, for God's sake. We have 2,000 buses, 2,500 high voltage buses in California. This was a 2-bus system to just elucidate the example that we are wasting away TPD capacity, very valuable, for a generation that may from time to time be available to run, and that time may or may not correspond to the time the system needs it. And yes, if it runs and the system is heavily loaded, it gets congested away. But that's a congestion issue, not RA capacity issue for RA capacity counting. That is the point we were trying to make. We used that simple example to make that point. And basically our point remains that we are reserving TPD capacity for a generation that may happen sometime, and that sometime may not be valuable to, as opposed to making it available for storage resources to come in and give you dispatchable firm capacity. Thank you very much. I said a lot.
Yeah, I'll probably turn this over to Neil, but all his comments, and I still did not hear you address the principle about restricting it to the NQC value. But anyway, I'm sure Neil has a lot more.
By the way, before Neil mentions, one of the things I want to make sure that as you're going into this new world of 24-hour RA framework, what we are going to ask you is, PUC is coming up with capacity for every hour of the day, and it's based on not some average number, it's based on some exceedance number. We're just hoping that by you, because we are going away from ELCC to this world of new exceedance-based 24-hourly capacity number, QC number, that we're hoping in this new world, you don't take what PUC gives you and say, I don't care how much capacity you need, how much capacity, TPD capacity I should reserve for this thing. I'm going to reserve 3 times or 4 times that amount. I'm hoping that as you evolve into that new way, you at least in this new world, you actually use the capacity number that PUC gives you based on actual observation for that 1 hour. I just wanted to make that last point moving on. Thank you.
It's Neil here. I think, yeah, it's Neil here. I
point.
think, yeah, I'll chime in a bit, but I think there are a few points I need to just clarify as well too. One is that as the CPUC's methodology evolves, this issue will need additional review for sure. So we're looking at this right now in the context of the current ELCC value, recognizing ELCC derived QC value, recognizing that things will be evolving going forward. But today we're dealing with the facts that we have today. We do see the QC value coming out of an ELCC process, essentially, in effect, I'll be generous with the interpretation of this, in effect, a weighted average contribution, expected contribution of the fleet as a whole to reliability over an extended period of time. Whereas our deliverability test has focused on the reasonable ability for a plant to provide the capacity it would be expected to provide in times of stress system conditions. So this weighted average type approach over an extended period of time is not that relevant to saying, well, we're calling this resource deliverable based on its ability to contribute when we're in stress system conditions. How much can we expect? And using this analogy of the 14 megawatts, if no resource on the wind side could produce, if they all have transmission constraints limiting them to 14% of their maximum output, that contribution over a period of time is going to be a lot less than 14% if that's the maximum that we can get to the grid. So we see the deliverability test being the ability of resources to work together to meet system requirements. And as Danielle hit kind of right up front, that the purpose of our deliverability test is to ensure that the resources we're reasonably comfortable that those resources can be delivered to load during times of system stress. We do see this being a particular issue with the wind resources, where the gap between the current ELCC derived QC values and our exceedance methodology is the greatest. It's much less of an issue with solar, where the two values tend to align quite closely, and certainly for other resource types. So this is about where the gap occurs right now is on the wind side. But like I said, this is something we'll need to evaluate going forward as methodologies for QC counting change. But I think it comes right back to the fundamental difference in what the deliverability methodology was meant to achieve, which for us, both in the generation interconnection process and in the transmission planning process, is to provide a reasonable assurance that we can count on these resources to serve load at times of system stress, which ties to the inherent purpose of the resource adequacy program. So I know that that view isn't universally held. I think there will be more discussion about the purpose of the RA program itself as we move into our own ISO resource adequacy program review process. So we do see moving parts on this topic, but with the situation we have today with ELCC derived QC values for wind that are markedly different than what we would be expecting any plant on a case-by-case basis to reasonably be able to achieve, if that is the area that's getting the higher wind output in that particular hour. We see that being something that we have to provide the operators a reasonable chance of being able to access resources that we're calling deliverable and counting on for resource adequacy. So Dariush, I guess, so we'll look forward to seeing your comments on this, that, you know, we are taking this very seriously. And we do see other things evolving in the future, but I'd say the facts that we're dealing with today are what they are. And we believe we're aligned with the inherent purpose of the RA program and our corresponding deliverability methodology.
Thank you very much. By the way, I forgot to initially thank you for your flexibility and the fact that you have taken this process as seriously as you have taken, and you have offered such reforms at the level you have offered them. I'm sure Nancy, my boss on this call, is going to agree with that as well. We have come a long way. We have been arguing with CAISO about deliverability for years now, and it's good to see a movement, and we appreciate that. On this issue of deliverability for the purpose of GitHub, by the way, I want to say for deliverability for the purpose of TPP could be a lot more flexible, and you should probably set the rules, because you're in TPP you handle system reliability, system economics, policy requirements. All of those are coming into PPP. But in this particular purpose, the only use of deliverability assessment, when it comes to GitHub, the only use of it that we have is to give a generator a badge to sell RA capacity. And basically what we are doing, we are depriving a lot of generators that could provide RA capacity, at the same time reduce the amount of curtailment and congestion in the grid because of the nature of tens of thousands of megawatt of storage that we have in the system. We are not doing that. So that's why we are raising this issue. But we appreciate you listening carefully to our comments, and I thank you very much.
Okay, we have 3 more questions in queue. Next is Pushkar.
Pushkar Wagle from Clean Resource Consultants. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. Yeah, Dariush shared a lot of things. I'm going to limit my question to 1 or 2 specific issues. I think you stated on page 13 of the STAR proposal that you agree that stress but not extreme condition should be assumed for deliverability test studies, and that is certainly music to our ears. And you know, the issue that I'm raising, that we saw the kind of impact these assumptions have. You know, you presented the impact of the offshore wind dispatch assumptions on viable alternatives to meet the deliverability requirements for, let's say, 23, 24 sensitivity portfolio, where you know the 83% of the installed capacity for HSNR, you know, gave you quite a bit more than 100%, and that clearly showed the kind of flexibility. And as you get more updated information, you do update certain things. And that's what I was wondering, that could there be more reasonable way as we go about in terms of dispatch assumptions, that is between QC, but the arbitrary 20% exceedance, is there sort of midway some issue? Because clearly, as I was going through the straw proposal, what jumped out at me is some of your concerns about curtailments and congestion. In my mind, at some point of time, you have to see what level of curtailment is acceptable, and therefore, maybe economic studies are more appropriate forum to check on that, rather than going ahead with identification of some major delivery network upgrades to address that issue. So I was just wondering, Neil or Robert, you have any reaction to that?
Well, when we're in a situation where we're having to shed load, any curtailment is not really acceptable of resources. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, we're not looking for 100% assurance that there won't ever be any curtailment in those situations, but we want to be pretty sure that transmission won't be a problem when we're having to shed load. So I think
there is no. Go ahead. Sorry.
You mentioned I was just moving to your other question. You mentioned the wind resources assumption, and I'm not sure if you were going here, but we did update the wind resource assumption, and at least I'm hoping that we can also take another pass at getting new updated data for even the internal wind and solar resources. We haven't had time to do that now, or haven't gotten to that, but certainly the offshore was the highest priority, but I think it would be good for us to apply the same approach for updating the onshore wind and solar, and even the out of state. And so yeah, I think we will, but we have to get the data and do the analysis and then review the numbers and make sure they make sense. So hopefully
Absolutely.
that will be
and that's great. And nowhere I was suggesting that you compromise on reliability or ability to meet load. I think that should not be compromised. We are not suggesting in any shape, but I'm purely talking about generation curtailments, having RASes and having curtailments beyond RASes and those kind of issues. To what extent that is acceptable? Yeah.
We're not targeting. Our objective is, is almost entirely focused on making sure there's enough transmission to deliver the resources when we're in a resource shortage condition, under stressed conditions, as the paper says. But in my mind, it's really when you're short of resources, and every megawatt you're curtailed because your transmission is inadequate causes load shedding. That's what we're trying to avoid. Curtailment of resources happens. It happens regardless of what's going on with the transmission. Sometimes you have oversupply.
Absolutely. Understood. Thank you. That's all I had.
Okay, let's go to the next hand from Nancy.
Okay, hi there. Nancy Rader with California Wind Energy Association. Yes, I will also thank you for the reforms you're proposing, and we certainly support the changes on SSN and DFACs, which are significant. But following on what Robert just said, that when we're shedding load, any curtailment is unacceptable. I think it's really important to think about what the benefits of using the actual QC value in the study would be. So putting a little more specific example on Darish's and Pushkar's comments, if we think about the 20 gigawatts of offshore wind that we'll be planning for, if CAISO plans for offshore wind using an 87% output level, rather than the 50% ELCC or whatever the hourly slice values would be, that will have the effect of using up many gigawatts of TPD capacity that could otherwise be available for storage and other capacity resources to help integrate that wind by absorbing production above QC levels and then dispatching when production is below QC levels. So that helps with the shedding load problem, right? That helps with the curtailment problem. So it's just really important to think about what the benefits are. What do we get from using actual QC values? So I'd welcome comment on that, but I also have a follow-up question about, and I'm really glad to hear that you'll continue to monitor the PUC's development of the new slice of day NQC values. But they already have come out with values, hourly 24 hourly values for wind and other resources, which I'm not sure they're final if they might change them, but they're close to final. So I'm wondering if sort of when will that happen, and would you consider looking at the values that are already out? Thanks.
I'll look to Neil or Danielle on those, I guess.
Oh, yeah, it's Neil here. I'll start and I'll see if Danielle has more to add on it. So Nancy, appreciate this, and we do see it being a moving target right now. My understanding is that there are draft numbers out, but nothing has been finalized. So short answer is trying to respond now to work that's in draft, not a good position to be in. So we want to see how this evolves as it moves forward, and take it from there. And with the whole issue with the offshore wind, it's also a little different where our offshore wind resources may be getting paired up with storage, but will not otherwise be competing with resources coming out of those same areas, we would expect. So that's something we'll have to work on as we move forward. But I think we also have to take into account right now the situation of where we do have a standalone wind project. What is each farm reasonably expected to contribute at times of stress, or be capable of contributing at times of stress conditions, and recognizing that there is an awful lot of averaging going on. If all we ever do is plan for the average from any facility, then that average is going to end up dropping, because we can't have other resources above average when some are below. So it is a unique situation. We do see needing to monitor this going forward. But certainly with the QC values that are being used right now, we just don't see how that's a supportable dispatch assumption in studying whether or not we have enough transmission to access those resources reliably in times of stress system conditions. So that's what we keep coming back to. And I know there does seem to be a gap in terms, a difference of opinion about the purpose of the RA program and the purpose of the deliverability methodology as part of that. But that's where we're looking at. Now, in terms of how offshore wind would integrate with storage and the capacity trade-offs there, the other issue to consider is that the offshore wind is looking at a much different output factor and a much different daily pattern. So it's going to raise other issues as well too about how that's managed overall, including the transition going forward as CPUC has been putting more energy only resources inside their portfolios as well. So it's going to raise a lot of questions going forward about how storage aligns with variable resources to provide an overall adequate system.
Okay, well, I won't repeat Darish's arguments, but yeah, we do have a difference in interpretation of the purpose of the study, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have one last hand from Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with Customized Energy Solutions. Just first, can people hear me okay?
Yes, hi.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not trying to beat up on wind, but it is a good example for what I'm doing, the point I want to make. A lot of the current wind resources in California, when you have the high stress system conditions, is reduced because of the high pressure, that's created, these big giant high pressure systems, so the output drops. But there are a lot of times where wind is producing a lot of power in evening periods of the shoulder months. And since all these wind sources are all located in the same geographic area, and they're all coincident with each other, that seems like to be, if you want to count wind and maximize its use to meet the reliability targets, you want to make sure that it can deliver all the wind when it's blowing the most and not get curtailed. And since this is sort of a local deliverability study, are we missing something by not examining, at least for wind, this case where it's not necessarily trying to look at the deliverability of wind during the stress conditions, because that's only looking at it from a reliability window for that condition. But as looking at to both, maximize the renewable portfolio, and then again, it will sort of enter into the whole slice a day function that the CPUC is looking at, and looking at it both seasonally and hourly, going, hey, can I use a wind resource at the maximum hours and not be curtailed? So it does have a feedback loop on the deliverability in the slice a day program, because you could get, well, yeah, the exceedance approach is very high, but if all these resources get curtailed, then its net QMQC all of a sudden drops. So that's my question on sort of where this fits into what we're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, so I wasn't quite clear. You started out about wind producing during like shoulder load periods, non-summer peak load periods that produces high amounts. And I think you also mentioned that when it's hot and the load is really high, the wind, because of these high pressure zones, I think you were saying the wind doesn't produce much. And so I wasn't quite sure what you were really commenting on. Are we commenting on, because what we're studying is those peak load days, when the load is like 95% of the annual peak, 100% of the annual peak. And those are the conditions we're studying, and we're even certain hours of the day. We have this HSN study, which is hours 19 through 22, so it's fairly specific. And then, but we are looking at the wind production during those conditions. Again, we want to try and update that for the onshore wind, but for the offshore, we just did that, and we got like 83%. Offshore wind, apparently, when the high pressure is inland, apparently the offshore wind still blows, and so that's good. But when it is blowing, we want to make sure there's enough transmission. But I wasn't sure which you were focused on. Were you focused on wind all year round, or just during the heavy load periods when we really need megawatts?
Well, certainly looking at during the heavy load periods, is a reliability question. No doubt about that. But I was thinking about how are we going to make sure the transmission system is built to accommodate a high renewable portfolio? If you want to be able to incentivize people to invest in least cost renewable portfolios of wind, mix of wind, solar, geothermal, batteries and storage, et cetera, you want to make sure they're deliverable when they can produce as well, which may occur outside of the high stressed areas. Because, how the new program that the CPC is developing is, it's not just looking at the annual peak summer months, it's going to be looking at an entity's resource portfolio throughout the entire year. Yeah. And so we do have a question of not only, there's a question is obviously we want to meet these conditions here, but how can we make sure that the transmission system's available to accommodate a fleet and hopefully get a least cost fleet when there can be high amounts of production during these non-peak periods?
Yeah, so we run several other studies. We're talking about one particular study. We're talking about this HSN study, the on-peak deliverability study, but in the transmission planning process, as we already said, we'll be running actually 2 on-peak deliverability studies. We also have an off-peak deliverability study. We run production cost simulation analysis, 8760 type analysis, hourly production cost simulation. And we also even run these snapshot cases looking at particular snapshot hours, mostly focused on serving load, but we also look at sensitivity cases you know, spring high renewable outputs. We look at a whole number of studies, and we'll probably be looking at even more going forward to address the concern that you're raising. This is admittedly one piece of it. It's a very important piece, and it is part of making sure that we're making sure these resources are deliverable for during this heavy load period. But as I'll get into later, we do also use this one particular study for our NERC compliance as well as just for deliverability. But we look at a whole collection of different transmission planning studies. If you look at our study plan for the transmission planning process, there's a lot more different types of analyses that we do. It's not just this one. So I encourage you to follow our transmission planning process if you're interested in what your where your comment is going.
Yeah, I am following the transmission process fight, but kind of earlier what you said is that, you know, the transmission planning process looks at a much wider area, you know, and I understand, the whole issue of offshore wind and how that's going to work is kind of looking at a bigger picture level. But my understanding, this one's looking at now we're going down to a specific project located in a specific area and making sure there's deliverability. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, I wouldn't characterize our transition planning process that way. It sounds like maybe you saw the 20-year, we just had a meeting about the 20-year plan. That sounded like what you're describing. Again, that's just a small facet of what we're looking at. We do look at 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out, 20 years out on a very localized level. We need that to be in compliance with the NERC standards. So again, unfortunately, our planning process goes over a whole year. There's at least 4 meetings, probably be 5 this year, at least. And so, yeah, after you see the whole study plan and look at our last transmission plan, we just posted, you'll see there's a lot more studies that we do. We always want to do more, but we do a lot more than what we're talking about today.
Yeah, but as developers develop projects and load serving entities wanting to purchase those portfolios, they want to be able to basically and to comply with the future CPUC slice a day. They want some sort of confidence that they can deliver the actual power to meet what's possible to generate, and the transition system is going to be able to handle it. And I think this is a changing evolution of the role of the CAISO and it's not just reliability at the peak time periods. It's also looking at the deliverability of these assets, of these renewable assets, and this grid transition to the grid to a renewable emission-free grid, and those issues are going to come up. Especially, I think wind seems to be the special case for that. So solar also has similar issues. It's obviously coincidence with the hours of the day, but it's again trying to build this fleet, and it's just not clear to me exactly where in the various CAISO process. You said it's in the transmission planning process, but then how does that interact with this process? It's not clear to me, so maybe I need to look deeper into it. So, but I don't want to belabor too much on this issue because I know there's a lot more questions that, and part of your presentations going forward.
Yeah, it's Neil here. I just wanted to chime in that, like you said, we do see the deliverability test being a test that's applied in the generation interconnection process around the adequacy of transmission to meet that stress system condition. But that's the one issue addressed in the high system need case. As Robert was saying, though, the entire system that's under the ISO operational control, down to all voltage levels, are examined in detail congestion is examined as part of our economically driven studies to assess if there is congestion, transmission-related congestion appearing on the system that we can demonstrate that it's in the ratepayers' interest to alleviate. And if that congestion is getting in the way of achieving those energy goals, then that transmission would either move forward as a policy-driven project or more likely as an economically driven project around accessing that energy. So the broader picture about curtailment over the course of an entire year is assessed in the transmission planning cycle. And like I said, we do move on projects, and we've moved on projects on very small parts of the system, I think down to 70 kV. If I remember correctly, it was a few years ago on very small projects compared to some of the larger grid reinforcements that were alleviating particular local congestion, that we could build the case that it was in the ratepayers' interest to fund that transmission. So we do take that part very seriously, that this is not just planning for peak load and assuming that works. It's been many years since that worked on our grid, and as the fleet gets more complex, and Robert said we're already doing a number of different tests and we expect to do more. That will be the evolution as the fleet evolves. But today we're talking about what's that test that we apply for resources to count for a resource adequacy program, given what we believe the intent of the program is and what our necessary responsibilities are for transmission to achieve the intent of the RA program. But yes, like Robert said, the transmission plan does touch on these other aspects that we'd be happy to see you participate in those and take a look at those issues.
Okay, thank you for the discussion.
Okay, there are, no other questions, thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So moving on to the next topic, which is the simultaneous dispatch of resources within a study area. So I'll start by saying the purpose of the study is to demonstrate that generation in a particular sub-area can be exported simultaneously to serve the peak load in the balancing area. And also that the electrical sub-areas are determined by generator distribution factors, which we'll talk about in the proposal piece of this. Next slide. So stakeholder comments on this topic were that recent resource shortage events, during recent resource shortage events, there was no lack of transmission capacity. And another comment was that PJM, as we mentioned, we do pay attention to what's going on in the industry, and it was brought to our attention that they have changed from using 5% distribution factors for all facilities to using the 10% distribution factor for 500 kV and above facilities. And I think the last comment was stakeholders were also concerned that the local deliverability issue needs to be addressed in this forum. That point's been made a few times, but this time it was because their concern was that it involves technical transmission studies, so it really should be addressed in this forum. So again, those are just the main comments that we wanted to address. Next slide, please. So the first stakeholder comment, actually supports the premise that the deliverability methodology is or was doing its job. That even under stress conditions, when all RA resources were being called upon, the transmission system was adequate and was not a barrier to accessing those resources. Regarding the DFACS comment, with the 5% DFACS currently used as the threshold for 500 kV line overloads, the electrical and geographic area captured within the group can include multiple interconnection study areas. And so basically the ISO does agree with the stakeholder proposal to raise the 5% distribution DFACS threshold for 500 kV line overloads to 10%. 10% is expected to be a more practical threshold in order to exclude generators that have more of an insignificant impact on high capacity, low impedance 500 kV constraints. And next slide, please. So in response to the comment that changes to local deliverability should be addressed as part of this initiative, with manageable interconnection queues, local deliverability is expected to be rarely be a problem. These LCR areas, if you will, they are primarily load pockets. And so when the amount of generation in the queue is more manageable, like it was in the past, we really didn't have a lot of local deliverability issues. And in rare cases where applications are high in local capacity areas, where flows not only reverse out of the area but also exceed transmission capacity area, the ISO is looking at the interconnection process enhancement stakeholder initiative to better address the intake of these new interconnection requests. So hopefully the queues will be more manageable after going through that process and it's successfully implemented. And also, just on the last point, the ISO will have transmission planning engineers participating in this resource adequacy capacity initiative. So they will be able to address technical content even in that initiative. So we will make sure that that's not an issue. So that's all I had on this simultaneous dispatch topic. I guess we can take some more questions.
Okay, we've got two hands raised. The first one is Dariush.
Hello, Robert, again. So the first question is on DFACS. In the past, you used two criteria for including generators within the 5% circle or within the circle of interest. One was the DFACS, which was to be above 5%. And thanks for raising it to 10% for 500 kV lines. And second was the flow impact. You also included flow impact. In fact, if a generator had a DFACS of say 3% but was big enough, its flow impact will throw it inside the circle, the 5% circle, or the generation circle that you would focus on. Are you keeping the flow impact still as part of your criteria?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's it for now.
Okay, let's go to the hand from Susan.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm going to apologize. This is a stupid non-power flow engineer question, but I was struggling as I was reading through this to try and understand sort of what the practical impact of this would be. And does it have to do with the fact that there will be less generation behind a constraint, or can you sort of, or are there fewer generators that would be subject to, is it a cost question, cost allocation? I was just trying to, so the DFACS was 5% and now it's 10%, but what would you expect to be the result of that in practical terms?
Well, I think you kind of answered it already in that essentially with the 5% distribution factor cutoff, all generators which have a 5% distribution factor, or as Darius mentioned, if the generator is so large that its incremental flow is more than 5% of the line rating or the transformer rating, then all those generators are now subjected to that constraint. If there are network upgrades needed, LDNUs, primarily the local deliverability network upgrades, then they would be responsible for their portion of the cost based on their distribution factor. So low distribution factors end up with less cost compared to a same size generator with a higher distribution factor. But nevertheless, they would get some cost even if they're, say, 6% distribution factor. Moving that up to 10%, a 6% distribution factor on a 500 kV line constraint would no longer have any cost responsibility for an LDNU. Not that we ever have any 500 kV LDNUs. So the main, I guess, example I should focus on is really in the TPD allocation, in the NQC, where we have to provide, have interim deliverability and things like that. So it's really just, are you going to be subject to a TPD allocation constraints for this 500 kV constraint? If you have a 6% distribution factor on a 500 kV constraint, you wouldn't have to worry about that constraint in the TPD allocation. You would get it, and if that was the only constraint that you had to worry about, you would get a TPD allocation with a 10% distribution factor. With a 5% distribution factor, you may not. That's going to depend on your score and all that in the allocation process. Or in an NQC situation, if there's a little bit of interim deliverability that you could have access to, but that one constraint is binding. Again, if you have a 6% distribution factor, when you go from 5% to 10%, you don't have to worry about that constraint anymore. I'm not sure I explained that well, but
no, you did actually. So it has to do with the interconnection studies with LDNUs, has to do with the TPD allocation, and it has to do also with the interim deliverability. Okay, so that actually was very clear. Thank you. I do have one remaining question then. Is this only for 500 kV lines, or is it for other constraints as well? It was a little unclear to me when I was reading through it.
Only for 500 kV lines.
Okay, and is there some reason why you would only do that for 500 kV lines and not transformers, substations, or all of other 500 kV transmission elements?
Well, a 500 kV transmission line has breakers and switches and conductor and so all that, when I say line, I'm not just talking about just the conductor. So it is pretty much all 500 kV equipment that could show up in a deliverability study would be based on a 10% distribution factor. So I thought you mentioned some of the other 500 kV. There would be no other 500 kV equipment that would be a problem other than lines, pretty much, because those include all the equipment. Buses we don't really deal with in the deliverability study. We do our best to deal with that in the reliability study.
Would that include transformers then also?
So then transformers, that's a different story. Basically, I guess really all transformers would be 500, 230 kV transformers. There may be a smattering of 500, 115 kV transformers, but those have a higher impedance, and they tend to have lower ratings. The 500 kV lines have like 2,000 to 3,000 MVA ratings. The transformers are only about 1,000 MVA. They're smaller, and their impedances are higher, so they're less likely to have that much of flow. So we did not include the transformers, and just not that we're complete copycats, but the PJM does not include 500 230 kV transformers either.
Well, aren't transformers also sometimes the limiting element for something like this?
Well, they can be. They can be, yes.
Okay, so is there some reason why you would not include them?
God, I just give you my best answer.
Oh, all right. Okay. Then I will think some more about that and see if I can understand it better. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for trying. I appreciate that. And I will get off the phone now from this one.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the next hand from Ellen.
Yeah, hi, this is Alan Combs with New Energy Works Consulting. And I also express my appreciation for looking at some of these, making these changes that are proposed by CAISO. On the flow impact, well, on the DFACS criteria, raising it to 10%, as you just mentioned, it's really the DFACS or a percent on the flow on the element that's overloaded. And as you noted, if it's 500 kV, its rating could be well above 1,000 MVA. And so I'm wondering if there couldn't be also basically an and condition. And I'm thinking about smaller projects that a lot of them are going to be in local areas. They're going to still have a DFACS on a 500 kV overload, sorry, a 500 kV limiting element, an ADNU. So they're going to be over 10%, but if their DFACS was even, say, 30%, that's going to be a 6 megawatt flow on, a 1,000 MVA line. I don't know, that doesn't strike me that that's going to make or break a lot of deliverability on the line. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't consider also either creating an and criteria or also having just some de minimis flow impact threshold on 500 kV, because right now it's or, so if the DFACS is above 10%, it's going to be subject to that 500 kV constraint regardless of how small it is, right?
Yes, that's right. But when it comes to little projects, first of all, they tend to be on the lower voltage systems anyway, so they really shouldn't be impacting the 500, or there's a whole bunch of them and a whole bunch of little projects add up to a significant contribution. And then also on their cost impacts, they if there are upgrades, they would only pay in proportion to their actual incremental impact. They wouldn't pay the same as a large generator. So anyway, to start exempt little generators, and then you end up with a bunch of them. Now you have possibly a problem. So it's hard to do that in a fair discriminatory way.
Although you've kind of started going down the road by just keeping them out of the effective circle anyway. So you could have a lot of little problems of 6% DFACS projects as well. I'm just trying to say, isn't there some megawatt threshold you could also recognize on the flow impact on the limiting element?
Yeah, that could also be gamed as well. Some guys got a, what number we want to put there. 100 megawatts, we'll get a bunch of 99 megawatt projects, right?
All right, and the other, and you mentioned cost allocation, but this really could make or break a TPD allocation, which is really binary. It's not, doesn't help that. I mean, there really isn't a concept of cost responsive with ADNUs. It's just whether you get the TPD or not. So anyway, I appreciate your response. I had a related question, and I don't even know if this was in scope, but let me just ask it because I think it's close enough, which is that think of everything I just described, but also a project that provides local deliverability as well as system impact deliverability. Is there really no recognition of projects that can provide local deliverability in terms of their priority to get deliverability? We're going to have a situation where certain areas are not going to get deliverability in load pockets. Sorry, in local reliability areas, because for whatever reason, larger projects that are just system only are going to grab the lion's share of TBD, and then we're going to continue to have local area problems. So I just want to put that out there, and whether CAISO has considered that as part of this process.
Not as part of this process, but I believe that was provided as an input to the interconnection process, the ITE process. And another aspect of that it is also been raised, and we've discussed it already, as some version of that will be discussed and considered in the resource adequacy initiative, as I understand. So I think in two other processes, but this local versus system or TPD allocation priority based on local, those are being addressed in different initiatives, but not this one.
All right, I appreciate that. And well, and one other area is just, you know, above the 5 or 10% threshold, you're going to have projects with 15% defects and projects with 30% defects. And so the projects with 30% defects consume the TPD at twice the rate of the 15% projects. Is there no, at one point I thought CAISO had some algorithm that tried to maximize the amount of deliverability allocated, like, you know, 1 over, I don't know, like 1 over the square root of the defects or something. Is there any consideration given to relative impact in terms of allocation to try to maximize the amount of TPD that can be allocated?
Well, again, not in this process. That is an IPE issue, and I believe that is being considered in IPE. That was someone else provided that comment. I provided that comment myself. So that is being considered, I believe, in IPE.
All right, and I apologize, I'm not following that, although I would, when I think of IPE, I thought that was more for cluster 15 on, and I think these issues are pretty ripe for pre-cluster 15 allocations, but I'm sure somebody's raised that in IPE as well. All right, well, thank you.
Okay, and we have one more hand, Dariush.
Okay, I wanted to now ask my second question. I wanted to wait for others to chime in. Actually, thanks for raising the issue of local deliverability. And I think Alan's covered some of the questions that I wanted to ask, but one thing that I wanted to mention to you is, based on our calculation, we have noted that a lot of projects in Bay Area load center, in certain pockets of Bay Area load center, cannot get system deliverability designation. And in fact, because of the L500 constraint, and especially after the addition of Collinsville substation. So somehow this issue of local deliverability is a critical one, and I think it requires transmission planning input beyond the what happens within the RA stakeholder framework, as well as the IPE framework. So that's, I think we've been talking about local deliverability, but CAISO made it clear that if you declare some projects locally deliverable, they would take away some capacity from other projects. So it's not as simple as one can think. Okay, if the resource can deliver to local load, and there's a lot of local load, we're talking Bay Area, but under N-1 condition, all of a sudden resources in Bay Area cannot get system deliverability. And funny enough, the addition of Collinsville is the culprit. It is critical that the issue of local deliverability to be looked at more carefully, because all these resources in Bay Area are not allowed to provide load to the Bay Area because they cannot get out of Bay Area under certain N-1 conditions. And we can discuss those in more detail, but I appreciate you paying attention to local deliverability, and I think your input is critical to the other processes who may not be looking at things using transmission planning type tools and thinking that you put into it. By the way, I have one quick one about transformers that Susan brought up. It's Susan's fault if I'm asking this question. I can understand why you're not including the 500 230 kV transformers in the 10%. And especially when we go from, if the constraints is from 230 to the 500 kV side, that you're limiting that to still the 5%. But what about if the constraint is from, I don't think that's going to be the case a lot of times, but there might be some times that the constraint could be from 500 to 230, as opposed to from 230 to 500, which is 90% of the time, that's the problem. If it's from 500 to 230, would you consider a 10% shift factor for transformers if the flow constraint is from 500 to 230? Would you consider thinking about it and maybe having some revise your idea about transformers as well, as far as the constraint is from 500 to 230? In other words, the transformer is there to serve load.
Yeah, I think the answer I provided before, I think, was not directionally focused on either particular direction. Usually, if it's going from the 230 to 500, it's something like Red Bluff or Colorado River, which is not even really a network upgrade in the first place. So we were mostly talking about 500, flowing from the 500 down to the 230.
Yeah, the idea was whether maybe 500 to 230 constraint could be treated differently, and the shift factor used there could be 10% rather than 5%, that you're correctly applying to 230 to 500 kV transformers. Okay, thank you.
Okay, there are currently no other questions in queue.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. So the next topic is the study of N-2 contingencies. Again, as background, the NERC reliability standards, FAC2 and TPL-001, require that common mode N-2 contingencies be analyzed. Excessive reductions in output to manage the risk of an N-2 contingency contradicts the premise that resources should be available to serve load. Therefore, we do propose RAS or system upgrades as the mitigation to mitigate N-2's contingencies, as opposed to something fictitious like congestion management all the time. The deliverability assumptions are designed to be plausible and reasonable, whereas the reliability studies try and focus on more of a more stressed condition, more of a theoretical stress condition, worst case scenario. And so if RAS is not sufficient and system upgrades are identified as needed in the planning horizon, it's based on the deliverability study. Next slide, please. So the stakeholders made the following points in their comments. Deliverability study methodology goes beyond NERC requirements. Reliability upgrades that currently come out of GIP are limited as they are based on a very limited set of studies. To address any concerns about reliability not currently addressed in GIP, an additional reliability test with an expanded scope could be added to the GIP. And finally, the comments were that such reliability studies should use generation dispatch similar to the generation dispatch in the TPP reliability studies, including redispatch of resources, or basically curtailment of resources. Next slide, please. So in response to those comments, again, going back to the standards, NERC TPL-001 requires that the transmission system be planned to operate reliably over a broad spectrum of system conditions and following a wide range of probable contingencies. N- contingencies are within that wide range of probable contingencies, as shown in Table 1 of the TPL-001 standard. Within the NERC prescribed criterion, it is prudent to analyze peak load conditions when all available resources within a limited area are needed to meet overall system load. The ISO agrees that generation dispatch similar to the framework used in the TPP reliability studies is a reasonable approach. However, unlimited pre-contingency dispatch is just not reasonable. The deliverability studies ensure that pre-contingency redispatch is not unlimited, and removing N-2 contingencies from the deliverability studies would require major revisions to the reliability studies to ensure that pre-contingency redispatch is not unlimited. Next slide, please. So as described in the straw proposal paper, contingency overloads identified in a well-reasoned base case base case dispatch assumptions are intended to be mitigated in the long-term transmission planning horizon by transmission upgrades. The deliverability studies provide a systematic and transparent method for producing a well-reasoned base case dispatch for local generation pockets. And as a result, the ISO relies on both the reliability studies and the deliverability studies to meet the NERC standards. Next slide, please. So as stated, the ISO is required by NERC to study N-2 contingencies, as are other ISOs, such as MISO and PJM. Therefore, the ISO does not intend to change this practice. However, the ISO proposes the following changes. If an N-2 contingency results in an overloaded facility but not cascading outages, then upgrades would be required but would not delay additional generation projects from becoming deliverable. If, on the other hand, a cascading outage risk is identified, then the mitigation for that contingency would be required before additional generation projects behind that constraint could become deliverable. Additional generation projects would be eligible for a conditional deliverability status during the development period of the transmission upgrades necessary to meet the N-2 contingency, mitigate the N-2 contingency, assuming that no other constraints are binding. Unlike interim deliverability, conditional deliverability would not be lost just because earlier queued generations come online, assuming that there are no other constraints that are binding beyond the N-2 contingency constraint. So that's what I had in terms of talking points. Are there any questions?
We have 3 questions in queue. Doug is first.
With Flynn Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. First, I want to thank you for your proposed conditional deliverability. I think it's a good improvement. I guess I want to push back though a little bit on the idea that on slide 27, where you're talking about it being prudent to analyze peak conditions when you need all the available resources in the area. And I think the problem I have with that is because you're only studying a subset of your system, you're assuming that you don't have enough resources in other areas to deal with the N-2 contingency. But I suspect that in many, many conditions, even in these very, very stressed conditions, you have more than enough resources in the other parts of the system to deal with the contingency. And I think that's probably why you're comfortable with this sort of conditional deliverability approach, because it isn't really placing the system at increased risk. And the reason I say that is, people are providing RA capacity that, because they don't get credit for the full capacity, especially for variable resources. There's a lot of capacity that's out there above the expected load level. When I say expected, plus the margin for stress conditions. And, you know, that capacity that is on a transmission system then in the transmission planning process was designed with taking into account the, you know, all these same contingencies. And it, because the probability of the N-2 contingencies is quite low. I mean, even the probability of the N-1s is very low, but N-2s is even lower. You know, it's just, it's extreme. I don't think we're talking about unlimited contingency redispatch. It's actually very limited. You know, when you're in the operating horizon, you can model those N-2s if there's a forest fire near a set of lines, or if there's a hurricane predicted. As crazy as that sounds, like we've now experienced that, or at least the fear of that. But it, you know, that's just one, you know, very limited subset of the system that would be affected by that, and you've got resources other places on the system to deal with the problem. So I guess my point is I do think it's worth studying what would be the impacts if you, in this process, didn't include the N-2s and explored how you could address those in the TPP process. Because I think what we're going to discover through this 8 to 10 year period while we're waiting for some of these already approved projects to get built is we're actually going to be better off being able to count on the storage resources and the variable resources that are going to be able to come online sooner, because the capacity will be there, and most of the time, almost all of the time, it'll be able to be delivered to load, except when you have these unusual events. In those other times, you'll have plenty of resources elsewhere on the system to serve the load. So we'll actually be better off and have a more reliable system with the approach you're proposing with the conditional deliverability. And my belief is you'd also have a more reliable system if you included that, you know, continue that approach on a long-term basis.
It's Neil here. I think I'd like to chime in first, Robert, or did you have something you want?
No, I was trying to hand off to you.
Okay, so I think it's Neil here. I think the first thing is that, putting it bluntly, coming out of 3 years where we've had to count on all the RA resources simultaneously, at least once in each of the last 3 years, we wouldn't agree that we can always count on other non-RA resources to be available. That's not our operating reality over the last number of years. We see declining fleets capacity outside of California. We see supply chain issues affecting the pace of new development inside California. And this is what the RA program to us is actually supposed to achieve, is to provide that assurance of capacity under these stress system conditions that we can access those resources and access them simultaneously. So when we're proposing this alternative approach, we're really not backing away from saying, well, we're planning on counting on other non-RA resources. Because like I said, that's just not our reality anymore. Rather, we're looking at the disruptions we know that have been caused to generators when N-2 contingency mitigations have taken some lengthy times to put in place, or where they were moving forward and they were derailed. And then our choices are delayed. And then our choices were we appreciate the consequences of generation having their power purchase agreements disrupted because they're not achieving this deliverability requirement. Load serving entities are scrambling for alternative resources, which is becoming even more chaotic as we have a higher pace of annual development. So for us, this is the trade-off of are we better off accepting the fact that some of these resources may not meet all of what the conditions we would want them to meet in a perfect world, versus having their in-service dates delayed? So I think we end up in the same place, but we just see it necessary to really ensure up front that the requirements in the long term are identified. We are taking, in our view, by moving down this path, more risk that some of these resources might not be available to the standard we ideally would have preferred, but that's a necessary risk to try to maintain the pace of resource development that we need to migrate to and then sustain year over year. So for us, this is a risk balancing, but not undermining what we see the intent of the RA program being, and the fact that we do see needing to count on the RA resources. This is not an academic exercise for us. Like I said, in each of the last 3 years, for different circumstances, we have been pushed to call on all available resources, including all RA resources. And, and as Robert had indicated earlier, it was a huge relief to us in those circumstances that we were not facing transmission limitations that prevented us from accessing some of those resources. That would not have been an acceptable driver for having to shed load when we were pushed to the edge, because we had underplanned the transmission system and didn't have access. And then unfortunately, we're getting more cause and effect, where events that used to be considered completely unrelated are now tending to be driven off of more types of occurrences that have a common effect. The high heat wave events driving high loads are also increasing the wildfire risk, smoke contamination, which is probably the single biggest risk right now for taking out double circuit towers. We're constantly having to remind people that smoke conducts, that the soot buildup is one of the major causes of losing some transmission lines and taking out corridors. So this to us, I think we end up in the same place, that the mitigations for these N-2 outages, we cannot afford to have them stand in the way of getting the resources connected and disrupting an already frantic supply chain management issue of getting new resources online. But the risk we're balancing is that we accept that some of those resources might not meet all the criteria we would have liked. We're not backing away from the fact that we actually need the RA resources to be available. Does that help? I think we end up in the same place, but for us it's a slightly different trade-off of risk than I'm afraid I was hearing you articulate.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Neil. I guess just to be clear, I wasn't just saying relying on the non-RA resources. I'm saying on the portion of the resource that doesn't count for RA. There's many of these are still RA resources, but I guess I would rather go down a path of, do we need a higher planning reserve margin? Because I think the problem you described to me seemed more like the issue was lack of resources, not lack of transmission. And I think what you're proposing to do is going to help get more resources. So I think that's great. And I think under most conditions, almost all of those resources will be deliverable. And when the market dispatches, most of the time it's dispatching to an N-1 contingency circumstance. And I think that's what helps address the concern that Paul Nelson was raising. And I think, as Robert said, you in the TPP process, you study those things, and I think it's really important. I guess, to me, I think the answer to this question comes from doing studies like you do for the summer assessment, where you're doing a probabilistic analysis and looking at the entire system and not just a portion of the system to see if you're okay, see if you have enough resources to be okay. And I'm not suggesting that, you change your whole deliverability process to do that, but I'm thinking that it would really help us to do that kind of assessment to understand this trade-off of the risk and reward. And it might be less expensive and less risky, more reliable to have more resources on a transmission system that's not quite, I'm not saying an unrobust transmission system, but is diverse enough to be able to deliver those available resources that you can count on, even though you know that some of the time, some of those resources won't be fully deliverable. And my concern is that the approach we take, because we're just looking at the portion of the system, we're not, that's not what we're studying.
And I think the point I hear where you're coming from on this, and I think those are interesting arguments to be made. I think that discussion, though, would have to take place in the context of the CPUC's integrated resource planning conversation, because right now that allowance, the overall optimization discussion takes place there right now. But when it comes to assessing the reliability of the system, a fully integrated generation and transmission looking to optimize, when we're also trying to manage the pace of new resource development, I think what we need to, trying to optimize that through one complete comprehensive exercise, I think almost sounds like an impossible challenge. So what we see needing to do is manage credible criteria for each stage that hopefully play together. And like I said, I think we're aligned on the common intent here that we don't want these N-2 mitigations to stand in the way of the pace of development. And that's why we're proposing this risk trade-off. But I think you're bringing up something that goes far beyond a deliverability discussion and really into the nature of the integrated resource planning process.
I think it does, but I think the problem is, and remember, my clients are not CPUC jurisdictional; they're their own LRAs, but they live in the world that's dominated by the CPUC's decisions. But the IRP process has a huge impact on what you study in the TPP, especially, and I think we're talking about humongous dollars, right? Not between the generation costs and the transmission costs, and the reality is it's just not physically. We're already experiencing this. It's not physically possible to get all this stuff built in the time frame we need, and so we need to be moving as fast as we can, and that's why I think what you're proposing is super important, because I think it is going to result in more resources getting built sooner that are going to, we're going to need. But anyway, I've taken more time than I intended. I just wanted to have this discussion, so I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, and we have 5 questions in queue. Next is Susan Schneider.
Consulting. Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I had a couple of questions about this idea of conditional deliverability and when you would figure out whether other constraints were binding or if there were cascading outage risks or not, or that sort of thing. So are you saying that, again, I'm kind of going for what are the practical results of this. So would projects get something called conditional deliverability, or is there simply a criterion that you would use, or a set of criteria that you would use to award, say, more deliverability than you otherwise might, but they would all be the same deliverability?
Yeah, that's a good question. Whether if we create a new term that almost sounds like a tariff change, I think that is still to be determined. But in terms of the logistics of the conditional deliverability, if you think about the analysis that we do, we study the N-1 contingencies and the N-2 contingencies together, And but the tool that we have nicely isolates the results between one or the other. And so we can see if the only constraint that this generator is behind is an N-2 contingency. And so therefore, they would basically get this conditional deliverability until the N-2 contingency mitigation is in place, then they would get full FCDS.
Okay. So is this something that they would be awarded? Would that be a TP? So their TPD, does this affect the TPD allocation process? So would we affect how much TPD you actually allocate?
No, because TPD allocation presumably will have a project approved in the transmission planning process already, and then we would assume that transmission plan, that transmission project is already approved, and then you get your TPD allocation. I think, in fact, we need to probably vet this. Again, this is just a straw proposal. We need to vet this maybe a little more internally, but my thinking is until we have a project approved in the TPP, I don't think we want to give out a bunch of deliverability and then decide that we're not going to approve it. Then you really don't.
No, I wasn't proposing that, but what I'm saying is if you have N-1 and N-2, so this would not affect the TPD allocation. This would only affect the timing where they would receive their FCDS designation.
Well, I would look at more the positive side. It would affect the timing of when they get deliverability and they count for resource adequacy, and that would be basically as soon as they come online, if that's their only constraint.
Okay, but I'm trying to figure out. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Robert. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
The main thing is to make sure there is a project being developed, and once the project is being developed, then we have mitigation for that N-2, and we can allocate TPD to the project, and then once they come online, if that's the only constraint that's the only project they're waiting for, then they can count for resource adequacy. On the other hand, if there's also an N-1 contingency that's also a problem, maybe a few generators can come online that were needing that N-2, but as you add more and more generators, now you start hitting the N-1 constraint. There's also that same project is addressing that N-1 constraint. Then then we have a different issue, and they wouldn't get the conditional deliverability.
Okay, so you have to have the N-2 projects approved, and then you do the TPD allocation based on that. And so you're talking about something that might happen later, where interim deliverability, you only find out the year before whether you have it for the following year. So is this something that you would find out perhaps earlier than that? So you have your allocation, you have your COD, but it turns out that your N-2 is going to be, say 5 years after your current COD, and you have to decide whether you're going to delay your COD to match your FCDS, your allocation, or are you going to try and come online and go for interim deliverability? That's the decision now. So is this something additional that, in addition to waiting for this interim deliverability, that you would get some earlier indication that you will then have conditional deliverability to cover that 5-year period? Or, and when would, is that what you're thinking what this is for?
Yes, I mean, essentially you get your deliverability as soon as the project is approved in the transmission plan, essentially, rather than having to wait until the project is then, permitted and built.
Okay. Right.
So, sounds like,
Okay.
And
so,
Robert, I was just wondering if I could also try to explain it slightly, coming at it just from the other direction, to say that right now we have projects that are moving forward. They're expecting deliverability, but they at a certain time frame. They may have an N-2 contingency mitigation that is now their critical path and will delay them getting FCDS for several years. What we would say is through this, we would take that off the table, that the contingency mitigation is still required, but we would award this conditional deliverability without that project actually being built yet. So
Okay,
that
so
the
but
N
it's not
minus
the
two
yeah.
the N
Okay,
minus
sorry.
2 contingency mitigation would not be their critical path anymore.
Okay. Well, first, I just have a couple of reactions. So is this something, when they get the TPD allocation, first of all, right now, people get TPD allocations and they don't necessarily know what upgrades are, which are the specific upgrades that are needed. So it seems like that process, aside from anything we're even talking about today, that process really can be much better communicated than it is. Because right now people, oh, great, I got my TPD allocation, but they do not find out later, or may never find out until they think they're coming online and get their FCDS, that there's some other upgrade that they're waiting for, and they didn't even know that because all they were told was that they got an allocation. So it seems like at a minimum, this communication about which are the specific upgrades that they need for their FCDS or, that designation needs to be communicated regardless of anything we're talking about today. Now, in addition, what I think you're saying is when you get the TPD allocation, you would say, here are the 3 upgrades that you need and when they're currently expected to come online. But this one is an N-2 that doesn't have the cascading and all the things you're talking about here. So this N-2 isn't going to come out is your longest lead time, and that's going to be coming in at this time. But because it meets the criteria we've laid out here, we're going to give you deliverability 2 years or 3 years earlier when the next upgrade will be finished. And so give them information as to when their FCDS, so their conditional allocation will become effective at that time, so they don't feel like they have to delay their COD. They can come online, and they can rely some time in advance, not limited operation study 9 months earlier or the year before, but some much earlier time that they would know when that conditional deliverability would be effective for them, based on what we're talking about here. Is that kind of what you're thinking about with this framework?
Yeah.
I agree with that too. I think that the difference between not studying at all versus what we're proposing is that providing it's not an N-2 that could create an unacceptable cascading risk, and I think most of them are not, that the generator would still be expected, there would still be the funding, cost, responsibility, and so forth, but that it would not affect their actual timeline for getting deliverability and being able to sell RA capacity.
Okay. And this is something that they would find out, say, shortly after, perhaps even at the same time they would get their TPD award. They would know which upgrades were needed, and then when they might expect their conditional deliverability, excluding these particular N-2 upgrades. So is that what you're envisioning?
Well, and they would at least be informed that this one is not a requirement to start selling RA capacity.
Okay, and they would know, given when this one's coming online, and they would know, you would tell them the other upgrades that were needed, and then given those other upgrades, when they might be able to start, to have this conditional deliverability become effective.
Well,
So
that's
they can
something
contract and know this when they are trying to develop their project and contract it.
The issue about all the rest of the upgrades that may be required, that's something I know Jeff is looking at about how to better improve that visibility. And that can become complicated, so I don't want to overcommit now in trying to explain the N-2. But the issue here for the N-2 is that we're looking at taking it kind of off the critical path timeline unless it's a cascading outage.
Right.
And the other qualifiers that Robert was pointing to is really, there could be other barriers for you getting deliverability. So this is just taking one issue. This issue is taking one off the table. It doesn't automatically preclude what other barriers there might have been. Does that make sense?
So there would be, first of all, hopefully transparency on what all of the upgrades that are needed for a particular project. But would you know this earlier? I think that's really the key, is even interim deliverability, you don't know until the year before. Okay, and late in the year before usually. And so is this something, you know, and you will have hopefully contracted way earlier than that. You have to have contracted before that to be coming online the following year. So is this something that people would know, say, when they got their allocation or shortly after, when they would know when their conditional deliverability would become effective so they could contract on that basis and be more confident of, you know, without having to risk, you know, to delay their CODs because they can't stand that big gap between their current COD and when some other you know, whether it's N-2, so that one's off the table, but even these other upgrades. So is there, but at least if I had certainty, they would be able to use that information. So is this something that would be given to them shortly after or when they got their TPD allocation, so they can move ahead with some confidence? Is that what you're envisioning?
So Susan, what we're envisioning here is taking the N-2 mitigation off the table as a potential risk, providing it's not a cascading. We do want to see what we can do to provide more clarity about the other projects that are on the critical path, but I can't overcommit right now to that. Like we're talking about our deliverability methodology and taking this issue off the table.
Yeah, and I think we get that, and it sounds like a very reasonable approach. I think what we'd like to see is some more details on this conditional deliverability concept and what does it mean? When would you know? How would it help? You know, I mean, I want to commend you for going this way and really, you know, it is taking a chance a little bit on your part to do this, understandably. So it's great that you're proposing to do it, but in terms of the practical details of what does it mean, I think we would just be in the next version, maybe looking for some of those answers.
And we'll appreciate your comments on that. I do see where you're coming from on this. But like I said, I feel like you know, right now you're asking if this is what you're going to get, and I cannot commit to the rest right now. I know that, like I said, Jeff and the team have been looking at how to improve the visibility and the transparency around what other projects people are dependent on,
which
that's
gets complicated. Thank you.
and it seemed like it's easier when you're first communicated your results, but when projects get delayed and sequencing gets adjusted, it gets very messy very quickly. So that, and we appreciate that, and that's something we really want to take a look at. It's just not something I can talk about today here.
Yeah, and I don't want to put you on the spot because I know I'm digging a little deeper, you know, than what you have here. But I think as you move forward to the next proposal version, I think that those would be the kind, and we'll put some details and comments on what, you know, what we'd be looking for and what would how this is great, but how could this really help? And we'll try and maybe help you connect those dots.
And some of that also smacks of leaning into the interconnection process enhancements effort around also a smaller number of projects, obviously, given some of the criteria changes in per quarter 2023, but there is overlap with the other processes. So I think you're hearing the direction we're trying to move on this. I just don't want to overcommit on a call here. But
Understood.
I do want to be clear about the change we are talking about making. Robert, are you okay with how I framed that?
Yeah, no, we certainly have been working internally about some improvements in some of the things Susan's talking about, but we can talk about those later.
Okay, thanks very much, and again, appreciate you doing this. I think you're heading in the right direction, and we'll look forward to just getting some more details as you're able to develop the proposal further. So thank you.
Okay, let's go to the next hand from Ryan.
Yeah, this is Ryan from Nextera. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, hi.
I feel like we've been dancing around the edges of this, so forgive me if I'm repeating the same question, but you have stakeholders on this call that are much deeper in the IPE weeds than I am, and they're coming at this from different angles. So I'm going to try to reframe this in another way because the straw proposal was fairly high level, and I need to understand this from my own angle. While we've been highly supportive of exploring interim deliverability, what's still unclear to me is whether the CAISO intends to provide more clarity into multi-year interim deliverability with visibility years ahead of when the deliverability upgrades will be done. And let me give you an example. If a cluster 14 project with a 2028 target COD gets TPD allocation in 2024, but it relies on deliverability upgrades that won't be done until 2032, there's a 4-year gap of uncertainty there. And we'd need CAISO to be able to say in 2025 or 2026, while we're in PPA contracting mode, whether the project can get multi-year interim deliverability when it can start, whether that be 2028 or otherwise. This is pretty critical for PPA contracting. So if the goal is truly to avoid disrupting the procurement cycle, it seems as though you would need a multi-year interim deliverability project with visibility several years early. And I don't think that's something that was contemplated in the STROP proposal, but it sounds like it's something you're considering. And I think I just want confirmation of that, and that in the next iteration of the proposal, that's something that we're going to kind of explore. I'd welcome any thoughts you have on this, because it's something that our structure and origination teams have been quite concerned about. And I'll just kind of leave it there for any reactions you have.
Well, it sounds like your question is going beyond this N-2 proposal. You're talking about even N-1 upgrades that are not in service, and there's a large population of generators wanting whatever deliverability is available until that N-1 mitigation comes in service. It sounds like that's the nature of your question, which is really beyond the scope of this particular proposal. And that, I believe, is being addressed in the IPE process. And again, I think folks participating in this process are also participating in IPE, but that's really not a deliverability technical issue, if you will. Is beyond this. Again, it's definitely beyond of this particular proposal, and it's even beyond the scope of this whole straw proposal. But anyway.
Yeah,
Well,
Robert,
well,
it's Neil here. I'd chime in as well too and say, yeah, this to us is an issue that needs the more holistic discussion in the IPE process than our deliverability methodology, like the technical criteria itself.
That's okay, Neil, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think because all of these initiatives, you have a lot of initiatives going on right now, and they have multiple touch points. So where something is appropriate to talk about is getting a little bit convoluted for us as stakeholders. So ultimately what I'm after is to know that if we get TPD that's dependent on upgrades in 2034, I'd like to know in 2024 whether I'll get interim status when a project goes COD in 2028 and keep it until I get SCDS in 2034. So if this isn't the right platform for that, if it's in the IPE process, that's good feedback, but confirmation of that is certainly helpful.
Yeah, and that is where we would steer that concern. So yeah, and I certainly appreciate stakeholders raising these concerns. That's great, so that we can steer them to the right place.
Thanks.
Okay, our next hand is from Chris.
With TerraGen. Hi there, this is Chris Devon with TerraGen. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thanks, Neil and Robert. Danielle, I think TerraGen would say thank you for the significant work you've done on this project, and I think we're very supportive of some of the aspects, especially the removal of the SSN scenario from the study process. And I did have a couple questions here on this one, trying to understand maybe a little bit around kind of echoing what Susan Schneider had mentioned as far as some more clarity. One of the things I was curious as to kind of what is the intent for what this would apply to? Is it just kind of those existing resources that are, you know, eligible for interim deliverability, kind of as what was somewhat discussed in the issue paper, or would this also apply going forward, like under all the projects that are in the TPP portfolios in the future, and you know, cluster 15 and beyond? Does that question make sense the way that I'm posing it?
Yeah, I think the answer is simple. It applies to cluster 14 and earlier and cluster 15 and later.
Okay, so any and all, and there's not some cutoff period that would only be eligible. No. Okay, that makes sense to me. I just wanted to make sure that was the intent here. So the other one was, if there is a, you know, project, the duration or the intent of the limitation on this, like, is there, you know, I really appreciated the way that the paper laid out the whole risk-based approach. After I read through that in detail, I thought that was helpful. But I just wanted to try to understand, let's say a mitigation project for one of these N-2 does, you know, get delayed, maybe, you know, 2, 3, 6 years or something, you know, does that then have any impact on this conditional status, or would that conditional status just keep extending until that project was completed?
It would just keep extending.
Okay, that's helpful as well. So one of the things I was just curious to maybe explore a little bit more on the position from the CAISO with this, as far as this TPP, you know, doing this in the TPP would be not as effective under the CAISO's perspective. And I think I just wanted to question that a little bit and see if you had any reaction to the idea. You know, from what I read in the paper, it was about the whole reliability studies and the way that you do unlimited pre-contingency redispatch in those studies. And I think basically the argument is that if we were to move this stuff to the TPP, then it would be requiring a significant redevelopment of the TPP reliability study or changes to that study process. And so my view of that is that perhaps that might be more appropriate, and the actual, you know, reliability studies might just be missing this solution that's being pushed over to the generator interconnection and deliverability side of things. And I think, you know, in the end, it's going to be the same money is going to be, you know, coming from ratepayers to pay for these projects in the long run. But I guess I just am curious as to, you know, is there any additional reason that you guys would not want to, you know, open up just simply, you know, removing this N-2 from the deliverability studies and focus that more into the TPP, you know, other than just saying that it would take longer and be less effective? Maybe help me understand that position a little bit more nuanced if you could. I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, the generators are driving the need for the upgrades. So if you decouple the driver for the upgrades from the cost of the upgrade, then you end up with, you know, I'm not an economist, so you end up with inefficiencies. Essentially, these generators move forward and get procured with the procurement process completely unaware that there's this transmission project associated with it that it will need and it's going to drive if you decouple that. So if you ignore all of the some of the transmission requirements in the generation interconnection process, then they basically get ignored in the procurement process. And then it essentially almost takes the value of the integrated resource procurement process away, because that's where, as Neil explained, the resource and transmission planning between the CPUC IRP and the ISO transmission plan, that's where that happens. But what they put into there is all the resources that already have contracts. Well, all these resources are contracted without knowing they're going to drive some upgrades. Then they're going to go into the portfolio, and the upgrades are just going to have to follow along, and it really won't be optimized. At least that's my understanding of. At least that's my answer to why that's a problem. There may be a better way to say it.
Well, it's Neil here. I'd just tag on to what Robert was saying, that the other way of looking at it is
You know, we do think the policy-driven transmission has been that entire framework has been extremely effective working with broader resource plans. But those focus on areas of resource development, but try not to be at the level that depend on which specific generators within an area actually get the contracts. It's meant to address a pocket of generation development. When we get down to an issue that depends on which specific generator actually gets a contract and moves forward, if we leave those issues to the transmission planning process, they will be late because then it's reactionary. So if it's built into the deliverability requirement up front, the requirement, as Robert indicated, is identified proactively. The solution is moving forward on a timely basis. But we do appreciate that we don't want the timeline of that mitigation being put in place getting in the way of that resource being successful. So we're trying to thread the needle here, and we think this is a good compromise solution of not leaving it to the transmission plan where it would be reactive after the fact and late to even get going, to mitigate once you know for sure which resources are actually under development. So like I said, that's the other way of looking at it from the pros and cons of if you can address something big as an area upgrade, great, but these ones more depend on which specific projects are getting contracts, and that's where we need that tighter resolution.
Okay, so thank you both. That was really helpful, Neil and Robert. I appreciate the explanation. That does expand well and help me understand, I think, this timing concern and ensuring that those costs are considered, in advance of the IRP process and ensuring that we're getting the most cost-effective outcome. So, again, I do want to thank the whole CAISO team that worked on this. I think we recognize that there's some significant improvements that are being made here. So we're very supportive of the direction, and that additional clarity helps. I definitely also would support some additional explanations just to confirm kind of those things that I was asking and maybe what some of those items that Susan mentioned. So we'll put that in our written comments as well. Thank you.
We still have some hands in the queue, but we only have 30 minutes left. So let's continue with the presentation, and then we can wrap up at the end.
Okay, next slide, please. So this next topic is area constraints and local constraint guidelines. The transmission constraints identified in the on-peak deliverability study are classified as area deliverability constraints and local deliverability constraints. In that framework, constraints with large amounts of generation behind them that trigger high-cost network upgrades are classified as area deliverability constraints, or ADCs, and corresponding area delivery network upgrades are identified. This framework is designed to avoid the identification of excessive delivery network upgrades that would be assigned to the interconnection customers, despite only being needed for generation amounts beyond the CPUC portfolio amounts. So we got actually just, I think, one stakeholder comment on this. So a particular stakeholder recommended that we review these guidelines. Their concern was that customers have very little control over the development of upgrades needed for area constraints. Whereas if the upgrade was classified as a local constraint, it could be funded and moved forward by the customer. And obviously they have more control. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide. And this is a slide I just went through. Next slide. So one of the considerations behind these guidelines was to process the approval of all major upgrades through the TPP stakeholder process, and for upgrades costing more than $50 million to actually obtain ISO board approval. This was expected to facilitate construction permitting. Another consideration was to remove the financial burden of high-cost transmission projects from generation developers. Next slide, please. So in response to the stakeholder comments, the ISO is considering options which may better result in, or at least may result in a better balance between these competing concerns. You know, the stakeholder comment versus the original intent behind the current framework we have. Currently, the cost threshold for a particular guideline, ADC-C4, the cost threshold is $20 million based on escalated dollars. And so we're looking at different, this is the one where that they commented on in their comment. And so the following options are provided in the straw proposal for comments and discussion. So we have three options. One is to raise the cost threshold from 20 million of escalated dollars to $25 million in current dollars. Option two would be raised it even higher to $35 million in current dollars. And option three is just to eliminate that particular guideline. We didn't raise this topic in the straw proposal, so we're really not proposing, or in the issue paper, so we're not proposing anything right now, but we definitely are looking for more stakeholder input on this particular topic. So are there any questions?
We do still have a number of hands in the queue. Maybe if we just keep it short, let's go to the next hand. Alexei, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. And I just had a really quick question. If you go back to page 29, you've identified if you're going to evaluate whether the N-2 will result in a cascading outage. Could you please clarify the procedure that you will use to evaluate this?
Yeah, we will have to do that in both the generation interconnection process and the transmission planning process in our reliability studies. And we will, you know, we put a link in the straw proposal to the RC West system operating limit, interconnection reliability operating limit, SOL, IROL, I think that's what it's called, but there's a link in the straw proposal about the way IROLs are identified is if there's a risk of cascading outages. So the plan is to really rely on that criteria that the reliability coordinator for basically the RC West has put out in compliance with FAC 14, I believe it is, and FAC 11, a couple of NERC standards. Anyway, so we would follow that for determining what is a cascading outage, but or cascading outage risk. But we would do that within the reliability studies, in the GIP studies, and in the TPP studies, and obviously document that and identify it and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, yes. I'm looking forward to reviewing the methodology and what you come up with. I guess my concern is I think most of the ADNUs, or at least a lot of them, are on 230 kV and 500 kV, so I would think they would fall into the category of causing or potentially causing cascading outage.
Yeah, above a certain amount of generation, that's probably true. We will have to, again, a system operating limit and the interconnection reliability operating limit, we should be able to quantify at what point that starts to happen. You know, we're not going to be super precise about it, but, you know, in terms of the ballpark, you know, if there's cluster 15 and, you know, type assumptions in there, and we see cascading outages, but not with cluster 13 type assumptions, well, then, you know, we should be able to identify those differences.
Sounds good. Thank you for the response, and thanks again for putting together the presentation.
Okay. And Robert, do you want to take the other question?
It's up to you. I don't know. I'm not watching the clock.
Let's go to Jenny Mueller. I'm not sure if we've heard from Jenny yet.
Efficiencies. Hi, Jenny Mueller, Utility System Efficiencies. My question also pertains to conditional deliverability. I was just wondering, when the CAISO considered making this change, you know, was there some sort of an assessment of how far-reaching the change, like, you know, the impacts might be? I personally immediately went to what was binding in latest 2023 TPD, you know, versus, you know, TPP approved projects, you know, to see, you know, which of these that might impact. I'm not seeing many, if any, that were bound by N-2s, and those that are sort of in the TPD report bound by N-2s. I remember in the group reports, you know, you see tables of them being driven by multiple combinations of contingencies, not just, you know, it might be N-2 might be the worst. However, there's right behind it an N-1 that's, you know, the overload percent is just slightly less. So I suppose my concern here is that we're talking hypotheticals. I'm just curious if there was any view when deciding to put this in here as to, you know, will it actually impact anything?
Well, I think that's sort of self-correcting. If it's a complete non-issue, then everybody should be not worried about N-2s. If it is an issue, then we have a solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to look at, you know, the actual 2023 TPD, and I know that there were a lot of, you know, approved TPP projects, you know, that, you know, due to the timing of that TPD report, you know, weren't included, which is great. So but when we look at those TPP approved projects, you know, in fact, the first one that you come to is N-2 with cascading outages. So we know for sure it won't apply to that one. And, you know, it just seems, so I'm just not sure that this, my concern is it's really not doing anything.
Well, we've wasted a lot of time at N-2s anyway, starting you off.
Well, I was going to say as opposed to looking at the TPD allocations, we've had a lot of concern from resources that were moving forward where their schedules were being impacted by the time it would take to get N-2 mitigations in place. And those were definitely being disrupted by delays in the N-2 mitigations and so on. So, so I think it's also just a case of the timing of some of these mitigations, and when there's been scheduled disruptions and these mitigations have been delayed, that it's been extremely disruptive for the development community. So even, you know, I'm certainly not disagreeing with your observation about the TPD allocation, but we've certainly had our share of disruptions being caused by extended delays in getting the N-2 mitigations in place. And that's where I was saying that the risk and trade-off of letting those projects move forward versus potentially losing their PPA because their FCDS was delayed, LSE scrambling for alternative resources, that's not been pretty. So that's the trade-off we're taking on the risk here.
That's good to know. I guess my only other follow-up then was on this page 33 on the topic we're discussing now. I think at the time that the dollar, when you last revamped this and the dollar amount cut off for LDNUs was brought up, I think at the same time it changed from like 20, I don't know, let's say the cutoff was 20 queued generators behind a constraint. And I think at that same time it switched to 20 generators that were queued plus ones that were just in the pocket, meaning it was made up of the you know, existing units plus generators in the queue. I guess my only thought was, you know, on these different options, did you give any thought to maybe lowering that threshold? Again, that would probably make more LDNUs possible if you eliminated existing units that were online from that cutoff.
Yeah, that wasn't a change. That was just a clarification.
I'm not sure I follow, Robert.
We didn't change that. We just clarified so that everyone was clear on what we were doing. It always included existing generators, and it included all generators in the area.
Okay. Okay. Well, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. So I guess we move on to the next slide.
Robert, I know we have more questions, but it'd probably be good just to finish the deck and then circle back.
Yeah, because I'm one of the things to Jenny is I think this one kind of maybe makes Jenny feel a little better about this one could be more beneficial, I suppose. It's not tied to just N-2s. So can we move to the next slide? So this is the final topic and it's on delayed deliverability upgrades. Currently, a generator must wait for all network upgrades to be in service before it can receive FCDS. Next slide, please. Stakeholders commented that network upgrade timelines are being continuously delayed, sometimes for 8 years or more, and this puts the state's clean energy goals and resource reliability at risk. CAISO must modify its deliverability methodology to grant deliverability when barriers to preventing deliverability assignment are highly unlikely to occur or harm reliability. So, next slide, please. So the ISO understands that delays to in-service dates for transmission upgrades can result in missing deadlines and power purchase agreements, and this can result in not meeting RA requirements, resource adequacy requirements. The ISO proposes to provide conditional deliverability based on the original transmission project schedule and accepting the risk of deliverability constraints for the interim period rather than disrupting the resource procurement cycle. Unlike interim deliverability for the transmission constraint that would be mitigated by the delayed Unlike interim deliverability for the transmission constraint that would be delayed by the transmission project, conditional deliverability would not be lost simply because earlier queued projects come online. So essentially, this is the same type of conditional deliverability as we talked about with the N-2, but you get there in a different way. It applies to all transmission projects, not just N-2 transmission projects, but it really is just if the original schedule for the transmission project gets delayed, then this conditional deliverability would be available so that, you know, everyone's plans wouldn't be unraveled just because the transmission project is not staying on schedule. So that's all the talking points I had. Any questions on this last one?
I wanted to read one of the chat questions. Hillary Hebert from HMH Energy Consulting said, is there a way to provide a sense of how much additional deliverability some of these proposals might create? For example, it sounds like your assessment tool identifies whether an upgrade is triggered by an N1 versus an N2 constraint. Maybe this data is available from past studies to provide a ballpark of how much conditional deliverability might become available if that proposal moves forward. I'm not sure how you could assess the impact of other proposals, but even ballpark numbers would be helpful.
We don't have those numbers. And, you know, it would take some effort to get to them. So I guess the answer is we don't have that information.
Okay, and we have 3 hands in queue. We have about 2 minutes per hand. We're going to go to Dariush first.
Well, thank you for getting my call. Could we go to slide 29, please? Slide 29. Okay. One of the points you raised that N-2 is condition is part of NERC condition and should apply to generation interconnection process. And we have no doubt that's accurate, that it should apply to generation interconnection process, the reliability portion of it. In fact, we think that CAISO is probably too generous in allowing N-2 outages during the reliability studies to be managed by congestion management as opposed to triggering transmission upgrade as part of the reliability upgrade. But and also in TPP, whether it's reliability part of TPP or deliverability part of TPP, N-2 is probably critical in both areas. But when it comes to generation deliverability test, that's part of GIP or GitUp, that is solely for the purpose of giving resources a badge to provide RA capacity. And there is no tie from that to any of these NERC requirements or N-2. In fact, if you look at both PJM and MISO, if you look at the portion that is of the generation interconnection study, which is for capacity designation, in other words, for to allow whether a generator can sell capacity or not, they do not test N-2 for that portion. They do it for overall generation studies, interconnection studies, and in case of PJM, even they call generation deliverability for part of the reliability studies. But when it comes to capacity designation, that is what CAISO does. They only do N-1. Now, let me come back and put that into context. In CAISO, we have a bunch of generators which have passed N-2 tests in order to get the deliverability badge and ability to sell RA capacity. When it comes to PUC process, well, we are looking at, and then of course, the reliability portion of it shows up at PUC case when all the RAs have to add up to make sure that we have peak demand plus 15, 16% on top of that. Let's look at the system condition. System condition is load is at 40,000 megawatt. Put 15% on top of it, that's about another 6,000 megawatt. Basically, we are saying that 46,000 megawatt resources are available, all of them with must offer obligations. They're all available with the must offer obligation for the RA capacity. At the same time, all of these resources must pass an N-2 to be part of that process where the total generation is load plus the 15% that's on top of it. And by the way, all N-1, N-2 conditions that were tested, that they were tested for, but specific to that individual generator or individual series of generators. So in effect, all these 46,000 megawatt of generation was supposed to pass simultaneously a large number of N-2 tests, because when you look at all of them must have passed N-2, each one of them having their own N-2, then you're saying that all of these generators must have passed a series, not one N-2, but a series of N-2 tests simultaneously.
Darius, we're going to run out of time. We only have a few minutes left.
Well, let me wrap it up. So this is equivalent to what Doug mentioned earlier, that when we are looking at generation deliverability for the purpose of RA, providing RA capacity, the imposition of N-2 test is probably a lot more than is necessary. And if they pass N-1, that should be sufficient, because you're basically pushing a lot of generation to have gone through simultaneous series of N-2 tests in order to provide that capacity at the time of peak demand condition. Thank you very much.
So I already spent about 5 minutes going through slides refuting most of what you just said, so I should probably just hand it up to Neil.
Actually, I think we are just tilling the same ground over on this, so I think we should move on to other questions.
Okay.
Okay, Nancy, go ahead.
Hi, Nancy with Kelly again. I just want to get clear on this though, because first of all, in a discussion with Susan, Robert suggested that we may need a tariff change depending on how conditional deliverability is implemented. But my understanding is the deliverability methodology is not in the tariff. And if that's correct, why would a tariff change be needed? That's my first question. And you know, and also this issue of whether NERC has requirements for deliverability studies. If they do have requirements for deliverability studies, how is it that you can make this conditional deliverability change without passing some NERC test?
So, oh, sorry, Robert, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that I was responding to one of Susan's questions, and she asked, is this conditional deliverability going to be something different than FCDS? FCDS is in the tariff, so if it does become something on the same level as FCDS and a defined term, well, that would require a tariff change. But I don't know. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, so it's Neil here. We'd be looking to see how we can implement this to, like I said, the goal there is to allow resources to get moving forward, but also get the requirements in place that we think are necessary for reliable operation. I know there's not agreement on what that looks like, but the goal is to not have the N-2 mitigations be an issue. How it gets framed as whether or not we actually need a new defined term to enable that to happen is something we're going to have to look at. If we don't need a new defined term and can avoid making tariff changes, great. But that's something we have to look at.
Well, I guess I'm still unclear of whether N-2 is a NERC or is not a NERC requirement.
It is definitely a NERC requirement.
Then how can you just, you know, say this is going to happen without, I mean, you know, doesn't add up to me. Either it's a requirement or it's not.
Well, and Nancy, it's Neil here. I feel like we're trying to take the question's trying to turn a really big nuanced issue into a simple yes or no, and it's more complicated than that. So as Robert said, studying N-2 outages is a requirement. Having plans in place is a requirement. What it takes to have the resource come online and sell RA capacity, can we do that before the upgrade's in place? That's something we feel we can do, but we're taking some risk. So we're trying to find a solution here that meets your objectives of not having these N-2 mitigations get in the way of resources coming online as quickly as possible, which is also ours. But we are looking at taking additional risk around being able to call on, in our view, the level of service we can call on those units for as a trade-off. But we do have to make sure we are within the four corners of our tariff compliance requirements at the same time.
Okay, I guess I would just echo Doug's request that we really should look and see whether we are taking risk here or whether we're not taking risk. We should apply your proposed approach and test it under NERC standards and see, in fact, if there is risk or if there's not. That would be very, very valuable.
When you say risk, you mean system risk or risk of not complying with a tariff requirement? Because those can be two different things.
Real reliability risk.
Real reliability risk, okay.
Yeah, because we don't know whether there is or not under this conditional deliverability proposal. We believe we are not, like Doug said, we believe the system will be more reliable if you let all these resources on, not less reliable. So I just think it's like Doug said, there's humongous dollars on the table here, and it's really worth testing. Thank you.
Okay, Danielle's going to go ahead and wrap up with the next slide.
Yeah, and thanks everyone. This has been really helpful feedback, and I think we've honed in on areas where we need to huddle internally and provide a little more clarity. So just the steps for moving forward, we do plan to accept comments through September 12th. There is a comment template posted right now on the ISO website. Our hope is to post the draft final proposal by October 9th, have a stakeholder call 1 week after that, and then accept comments on October 30th. And we are targeting a winter 2023 Board of Governors decision on this. As we mentioned earlier, this schedule does consider both the interconnection process enhancements initiative as well as the RA resource adequacy initiative that's going to be kicking off in the fall, because as many of you have noted today, there are a lot of overlapping issues. So thank you all for helping us tease those out. Next slide, please. And here's just the information for where to submit comments by September 12th and where you can find more information on the Stakeholder Initiative webpage. If you have any questions, please reach out to the ISO Stakeholder Affairs email address. And thanks again for all of your time today.
Thank you. And that concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.